Hello and welcome back to Call Center Helper. My name is Xander Freeman, and today we're talking all about our latest research, specifically around digital channels in your contact center. To help with that discussion, I'm so excited to be joined by Katie Stabler from CULTIVATE and author of CX-ism. Hello again, Katie.
Hello, thank you for having me.
No, thank you for joining me again. It's always nice to see you. So let's talk about the additional digital channels in people's contact centers. Massive domination of social, as you can see in the data.
Yeah, but you know what I found interesting actually? The first point that I picked up was I think it was something like 39-40% of those who responded said that they weren't using additional channels. Now, I had a whole question around that really. Now, if we had more time, I'd love to dig into it. But my question would have been around that. Well, what does that actually mean? Is that because we're not using additional channels, or because those additional channels are now kind of BAU, so they're not considered additional? The use of WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc., they're actually starting to become more integrated. So that was one of my first points really around the research that you shared, was actually, do we consider these additional channels as additional channels anymore, or are they just kind of part and parcel of the way in which we work?
I think that's a really interesting point to raise. If you look at let's say, the traditional tech stack, I think more and more they are becoming a little bit more integrated in there.
Mhm.
Specifically, like you say, it might not be social media or social media specifically to one channel, but social in general has a far greater light on it these days than, let's say, if you took your mind back 5, 10 years on there. And I think it's far more commonplace. So yeah, you may well be right there. But I think when you pour into the data itself, it's interesting to see this, let's say, demographic divide there with certain channels.
Yeah, and actually, that was something I was a little bit surprised about around Facebook. So, talking about Messenger, obviously, that's been kicking around for quite some time. I think from the data that it was something like a 10% reduction since last year when we asked. But actually, Facebook Messenger is still the predominant additional channel of choice. And that did kind of surprise me because, again, we talk about demographics, and actually, wider conversation seems to lean into the fact that people, the younger audience, are moving away from Facebook Messenger. But I suppose from the business perspective, it's a well understood, well known tool. It's got a lot of features that are, easy accessible and easy usable, and that community piece as well. So I guess it's obvious as to why it's still a really strong channel, but it did surprise me that the likes of like WhatsApp hadn't overtaken yet.
But I think it's one of those things, if you look at Facebook Messenger and, let's say, Facebook in general, it's been quite business friendly for some time now. And I also think if you look at the sort of demographics of the people that are in charge of implementing these systems in contact centers, it's probably a solution they're a little bit more familiar with
Yeah.
than the generalized. But let's take TikTok as example, which has great usage with, let's say, slightly younger generations, but ultimately is still on the rise when it comes to additional channel mixes. Whereas Meta, and let's focus specifically on Facebook, has that long history of, it's a little bit more known there, so you know what you're getting into when you're dedicating specific resources towards that channel.
Absolutely. And I suppose we've got to come back to usage as well. Why are customers utilizing different channels? And, whilst Instagram has boomed in popularity outside of the contact center space,
Mm.
of course, it kind of makes sense that it's not the biggest channel here because it's very visually driven, it's more kind of product led. So, of course, it comes down to actually why are customers using these channels? I mean, the TikTok one, that's a really interesting one. And obviously, it's still got a low take up in this space. But we see more and more companies outside of the normal use case of TikTok starting to use this kind of technology. And I think some data, I can't recall now the source, but something like 91% of consumers say they like to interact with brands with humor.
Mm.
And of course, TikTok is that place to share that sense of humor. And you're seeing all kinds of companies pop up there now with kind of behind the scenes views of their companies. So, not a traditional contact route, but certainly something where you're building relationships with your customers.
But it's also an additional level of training that's required for your staff there. It's one thing to say your marketing team needs to be funny when they're distilling that message, when they have time and resources to really develop that. It's also such a subjective thing as well. Putting that additional onus on the contact center is so difficult.
Massively so. And obviously, when it comes to public messaging and marketing, there is so much restriction internally and a level of red tape. And of course, you've got to be conscientious about the brand messaging that you're putting out there. So something as informal as TikTok is certainly not going to work for everybody. But I'd still hazard a guess that over the next few years, we are going to see a jump in the data in that.
And then let's circle back to WhatsApp briefly. You
Mm.
mentioned, it's not as high in the data as necessarily you or I thought it would be, but I think when you break down the regional elements of it, it makes a little bit more sense. It's obviously still very strong coming out of APAC, where it's been used traditionally for quite a few years now as part of the sort of wider customer contact sphere. But then when you actually look at, let's say, EMEA and North America, statistically, it has been rising quite a lot with our audience in the last year. And I think it's quite interesting to see how that will continue as well, as we both predict it will.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought in that regional element. I think, again, when I read the data, there's definitely a few surprise moments for me. And I would have expected WhatsApp to be more significant in the ranking. Mainly, I mean, it's quite anecdotal, but whenever I work with organizations, WhatsApp tends to be one of the predominant channels of use. Whenever, as a customer, I contact a company, I'm always directed to WhatsApp. So it was interesting to see that, yes, while it's growing, it isn't as strong as I expected it to be. I do think that will absolutely be on the rise. I mean, it's growing business capabilities are just expanding continuously. I think in the world of smaller businesses, it's quite strong. And I expect that, again, with the demographic changes we're talking about, WhatsApp at some point, maybe not over the next couple of years, but certainly in the near future, I think we'll start to peak over Facebook Messenger.
No, I think it's one to definitely keep a closer eye on.
Mm.
So I know there's a load of stuff you and I could be talking about with this data, but let's just round it out here. I always like to say, if you're a CX leader looking at this data, what would your key takeaway be from this?
We talk about omni-channel all the time, right? And giving choice. Ultimately, it just comes back to knowing your customers and knowing what channel they best interact with. And look, that's not going to stay static. It might change, and there might be a lot of nuance and deviation in your customer base as well. But you have to get it right. I worked with an organization who pivoted to WhatsApp a number of years ago. They were a housing association. The demographic was a significantly aged population, sorry. And unfortunately, WhatsApp was a cost-saving initiative, and it just did not work because it wasn't the right channel for their audience. So the lesson to be learned here is just know your audience and don't go with the trends. Don't go with what you think is going to be the right thing, but go with what is the right method of communication for your customers.